There is one unforgivable sin that if a movie does it, I struggle to get over it. And In a Violent Nature performs this sin. And we're going to be talking about my review today of In a Violent Nature, which is the latest film from IFC Films. And they gave us this new horror film that premiered at Sundance 2024. I just got to see it in theaters this week. It's called In a Violent Nature, which follows a mute killer resurrected from his wilderness grave by a group of teenagers whom he begins to viciously murder in this sadistic ambient slasher, directed and written by Chris Nash, and will be coming out to Shudder shortly after its theatrical run is done.
Animals don't get too hung up on reason. They just keep killing.
And when I'm thinking of a movie like this, specifically this type of premise that is so clearly borrowing on the Jason Voorhees effects of the Friday the 13th movies, borrowing the Michael Myers aesthetic, I have a few thoughts of what I want this movie to be, especially when I hear that this movie uses the POV angle. And what my brain does is it approaches it binary. It's a very binary approach to the subject matter. And that is, how did this movie satisfy what I wanted and expected out of this movie? My expectations for this are low. I just want to be thoroughly entertained for 90 minutes in a film that I find genuinely racked with tension and with real scares. That's all I really needed to be successful. As a genre play, that's all I want for this movie. So does In a Violent Nature deliver on this? And I think we need to break this down. And to understand this, I kind of have to break down the structure of how I viewed this movie, which is about 95 minutes. I think a fair breakdown of the movie is 15 minutes into this movie. If you want to say at the first act, my thought process was, where are we going with this? And then we get this banger of a banger 60 minutes of this movie where I'm just like, oh, okay. Oh my God, this is crazy. This is what I want this movie to be. And then we get to the 15 minutes, which ties back to my original idea of the cardinal sin, that if a movie commits it, this is where I fall off and we need to talk about it. So we will get to the ending, I promise. And here's what I want to say to start In a Violent Nature, because I think some people are picking up on some apprehensions that I had on this film, and maybe even thinking that this review is going to be overly negative. I don't want to be overly negative with this review, because while watching it, I had a very visceral reaction and found certain aspects of this movie to be really successful. And it is the most successful when it's closest to its Friday the 13th horror vibes and sensibilities. That is when the movie is working. And when it's mixed with this just energy of pure sadistic, almost juvenile glee brought about by the creative imagination of Chris Nash, who is a man who is clearly unwell based on what he does in killing people in this movie. It's very exciting that this visionary director has this style and approach to horror and makes something that feels new. That is when I found this movie to be at its most successful and its most exciting. When it's not doing this and when it's not succeeding on this levels, that's where the film starts falling into trouble, because the film's narrative is nowhere near strong enough, and the film's narrative problems become even more evident when the film is not living up to the excitement brought about by the sadistic qualities of Chris Nash as a filmmaker and as a horror director. Then we have a movie that really struggles. And when I, exclaim how great of an imagination he has as a creative horror director, that imagination doesn't carry over for him as a storyteller in this movie. There is no imagination when it comes to these characters. They are devices made to be killed. And that's fine. They can be tools for that purpose, especially with the protagonist of this movie being this silent killer that we are following through his eyes, essentially. But the issue is when we spend too much time with the people, the victims that will be killed in this movie, and they're fundamentally not interesting, and they are supposed to be disposable. But when we're focusing on that, it's this weird effect where it just doesn't connect and it doesn't resonate. Now, there are really good uses of the victims in this movie. For instance, there are certain scenes where we are following these characters in conversations, whether it's around a campfire or outside, anything like that, and we're watching them interact. And then in the background, maybe we see some rustling of leaves or trees, and we just know the killer is right there. So while they're having this mundane, boring conversation, we know what is about to happen and how just insanely violent and gory everything is about to become. But the issue is it still just spends too much time on these characters, and it's been described as an ambient slow burn. This film certainly has its slow burn elements to it. And for this 60 minutes where I talked about the film being like, oh my God, successful, that works. And the tension is totally racked up. It's the issue is at times this film goes away from that and breaks its own almost rules. And by rules, I mean the gimmick of which this film approaches it. Which brings me to my biggest complaint, which will tie back to the idea that I said earlier in this movie about the cardinal sin of this movie. And it's that the gimmick feels disposable. And some people are saying that this is a movie from the killer's eyes. That made me think that it's a first-person POV. That's not what it is. This is a third-person POV where the protagonist is the killer. It's the Michael Myers long shots. Those are exciting when Carpenter, or when they even did it for the reboot of the 2018 version. Like, those are exciting in those films, and they're certainly some of the best scenes in it. And this film uses them to wonderful effects. And that when the film is basically just that, that's when it's working at its highest level. But the issue is the film occasionally breaks that rule and breaks away from that gimmick to drop it for convenience. And this is just the case of, here's the cardinal sin that I was alluding to. The final 15 minutes, I thought, destroy all momentum due to a terrible finale. My cardinal sin is, despite how great a movie can be leading up to something, if the third act doesn't land in a way that is satisfactory, it can derail a movie entirely. That's not the case for every movie. Everything is a case-by-case example. But when an ending is as bad as this one is, I just think it actually ruins the momentum and the goodwill that I had towards this movie for 60 minutes. So when I'm talking about this and I'm like, 15 minutes, I start the film and I'm kind of like, where is this going? And then the next 60 minutes explain those first 15 minutes. I've got now 75 minutes of a movie that's working and paying off. And then when the final push of this movie, the final 15 minutes are supposed to be the conclusion, and it doesn't, it kind of sours me on the rest of the 75 minutes, thus hurting its math and proportions. And here is the big complaint that I have that I think led to this cardinal sin. And this is this concept of elevated horror. You hear this idea brought about, horror with more meaning. The idea that every horror film has to be about something. And the reason this is so poorly utilized in A Violent Nature is the filmmakers need to explain what the ideas of the movie, which undercuts the very ideas of the movie. What I mean by this is the final 15 minutes, and I'm not going to go into spoilers, but the final 15 minutes of the movie basically explains what this movie is. And we get this new character who's introduced, we get these ideas, and we get this very long, drawn-out conversation in which we are taken to believe what the metaphor of this movie is. Essentially, what this movie is about through conversation and through monologues. And I'm not going to spoil anything or where this goes or where it concludes from here, but to lay it out as thick as they did in the final 15 minutes really just breaks all suspense. And while watching it and the film finally ends, I'm like, wait, that's the ending? Like, that's what the payoff was? It just felt like something that could have been cut completely. Like, you could have taken this 15-minute ending and cut it down to 2, and the effect is the exact same. But the issue with extending this is you take away everything that the 75 minutes built to, and it becomes a very frustrating experience while watching it in the theaters, where you're just left scratching your head at the end and thinking, that's it. That's what the payoff is. And it's not even, because sometimes you can take payoff and flip it on its head and make something artistically challenging. That's not what this movie is. Actually, in explaining it, it takes away the artistic integrity that I found in this movie. It is just kind of a case where it's just like, it's almost the thesis statement for the movie, but where the thesis statement is said word for word. The intent of this movie is to blank, blank. And people who have seen this movie, they'll know exactly what I mean by this. Others might be a little perplexed, but in watching it, they'll understand. And that is not to take away everything from In a Violent Nature. There is enough in this movie working well. I talked about the sadistic qualities of Chris Nash as a filmmaker and a horror slasher director as in this film, and he does some really incredible stuff as a filmmaker here. There's a few kills in this movie that are visceral. They are some of the most upsetting body horror I've ever seen, slash some of the most deranged kills that I've ever seen in anything even closely resembling mainstream horror, which again, I know this isn't defined as mainstream, but it's at least mainstream adjacent. There is one kill involving someone doing yoga that is so viscerally upsetting that you can't help but laugh. Like, that is the level of which this guy captures certain horror in it. So there is a lot of just really exciting stuff in this film. The stalking stuff in this movie, as we follow the perspective of the killer, is extremely just well done, and you really feel this tension. Again, for the second act of this movie, that 60-minute runtime, I really was locked in to this movie, and it's just the case of this third act didn't pay off. But there are other exciting things where I do see the talent of Chris Nash at display within this runtime. For instance, I always find it ambitiously challenging when a director of horror decides to shoot a movie in daylight, which is what a lot of these scenes in this movie are shot in. Like, there is a lot of scenes that take place during the day because tension is just a little bit harder to rack up when you have natural light in it. And this movie being all shot mostly in natural light for a majority of it, since we are in a forest, I'd say maybe it's about 60-40, 60% during the day, 40% at night. Like, when you have so many of those scenes and you're still able to rack that tension, even though we always know where the killer is, we always kind of are in this killer's perspective as by the initial design of this movie. The fact that he is able to elicit that type of reaction for me, I did find impressive. So there's certainly a lot to recommend about In a Violent Nature, but ultimately by the conclusion of it, it just has this huge fundamental flaw that takes away a lot of the things that work so well about this movie and leaves you a little, or I should say at the very least, left me a little frustrated by its ending. Knowing that, though, I do believe that this movie, there is a lot for horror fans to take out of, and maybe some are going to find it too slow. I think the premise of this movie is wonderful, and the execution just doesn't fully live up to it, where I think people really wanted to love this movie and embrace this movie and this style of filmmaking, like almost feel like it almost becomes like a Blair Witch style where it's just like, oh, wow, I've never seen that in a movie before. And ultimately, by the end, I'm like, yeah, that's kind of how I was pitched on this movie. That's how the way that this movie was told or how it started really started to feel like. But then by the end, it hit the convention. And while some of the aspects of this movie are well done, it doesn't break far enough from convention to get to the level of excitement that I think people and the filmmakers thought they had achieved. Ultimately, though, I can recommend In a Violent Nature. Despite some criticisms I have of this movie, I do believe there is enough to just kind of make someone like just react. Like, this is a movie that I'd be hard pressed to believe that in an audience you would be able to watch and not react. Like, there's a few scenes in here that are gnarly and nasty, and it's just like, it's such a physical reaction out of that, and that's where I do find it impressive. But ultimately, it doesn't lead to what I wanted it to. And this cardinal sin of the third act just doesn't work in a way that I found ultimately a satisfying experience. With that all, I think there is enough to recommend this movie. I'm going 3 out of 5 stars for In a Violent Nature.